The vast majority of the issues that we are suffering with as a human populace when it comes to chronic illness comes down to nutrient deficiency. The vast majority. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but what about all the environmental toxins? There's a lot more poisons out there. Yes, that's true. But do you know that when you're nutrient deficient, your ability to be able to detox is significantly compromised? That the environmental toxins would not have nearly the same impact on us if we had the proper nutrients flowing through our system at any given time.
Welcome to the Upside of Bipolar. I am your host, Michelle Reidinger, and I have a repeat guest. As I mentioned last week, if you haven't heard the episode last week, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen because we're doing a potentially 4 episode series with David Stephan, and I'm going to read his bio in case you didn't hear last week's. But again, I encourage you to go back and listen to it because it's phenomenal. Over the past 22 years, David Stephan has worked extensively with Truehope, an organization on a mission to help individuals overcome mental illness through the use of groundbreaking micronutrient solutions. During this time, he has been involved in leading-edge discoveries that have not only provided significant transformation in thousands of lives, but have also been scientifically validated in dozens of independent studies from universities around the world. As such, David feels it a privilege and duty to share the knowledge that not only changed his life, but has also allowed for well over 100,000 others to transform their lives as well. Welcome back, David. I'm super excited for our discussion today.
Hey, thank you for having me on again. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so we are going to start kind of where we left off. We talked a little bit about this at the end of the last episode, but I want to start with talking about, I think, maybe the difference between what medication is doing and what micronutrients are doing. Often when I talk to people or people, ask questions about, micronutrients or want to understand it better, there's a mistaken idea that it is a one-to-one correlation, that medication and micronutrients are basically doing the same thing, but one works better for some people and another works better for other people. And the reality is that is not at all the truth. That is not reality. That is not factual. And so I want to start there. I want to talk about what the difference is between what medications are doing in the brain and what micronutrients are doing in the brain.
Fantastic. Yeah, so if we take a look at the drug model, when you take a look at the new class of antidepressants that came out in the late 80s and have been applied ever since then, that new class of antidepressants was SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And if we were to look at that example, if you have somebody who's depressed, and there could be multiple reasons why they're depressed, but one of those reasons could be that they're not producing enough serotonin. And so that particular neurotransmitter helps regulate mood and, makes us feel better. Same with dopamine. Well, in relation to that, when you take an SSRI medication, it's not fixing the issue where somebody wasn't producing enough serotonin on their own accord. All it's doing is preventing the reuptake of what serotonin is available. So somebody's producing, let's say, let's throw it out there, 1/3 the amount of serotonin that they needed, right? And this is all theoretical because nobody's opening up anybody's brain and seeing exactly what's going on in the brain to make these determinations. But let's just say hypothetically, somebody was producing 1/3 of the serotonin necessary. Well, now they're put on a reuptake inhibitor that prevents the serotonin from being reuptaken so that serotonin remains there, that it can be utilized again, right? And so that's, supposed to be correcting the issue in relation to the symptoms that would come about from a lack of serotonin. So rather than the drug getting you to produce more serotonin, it's preventing the serotonin from being basically dismantled, because the body has a natural process to ensure that these neurotransmitters aren't just free floating forever. They do their job and then they're dismantled. They're taken apart, they're uptaken, and the amino acid that's at the base of it will be probably used for something else again, right? And that could be for all sorts of things. It could be even for muscle production. It could be for, the bone matrix. The fact of the matter is that these ingredients will go and be put to use elsewhere. But that messenger molecule did its job, and your body has a way of processing it. So the drug is actually just stopping that process. Now, that can become quite dangerous, though, on another level, that now if you don't get it quite right, you may end up with way too much serotonin. And that's a bad thing. You may find that you go pretty groggy, that you find yourself tired. Your body starts to try to protect itself by going and taking the serotonin and turning it into melatonin, because you have too much serotonin now. And so now you're going to have melatonin, an overabundance of it. And we know what that does to people. And so there's various things that can occur, but serotonin syndrome in and of itself can actually be quite dangerous. And it can actually cause brain damage. And we've seen that happen through some pretty peculiar circumstances in relation to large amounts of medication all of a sudden being present in the bloodstream due to, liver cleanses and stuff like that. And so that's the way that, the SSRIs would be working. If we were to take a look at, many of the antipsychotics that are dopamine blockers. So it's just preventing you from having access to dopamine. It's preventing either the creation of the dopamine or its ability to do what it needs to do in the body by preventing it from being able to communicate with various cells and all that. So the dopamine blockers or the antipsychotics they're not making you produce less dopamine in that sense where it's just like you produce an overabundance, but that it's just preventing its ability to work efficiently in the system, right? So there's a big difference between how the drugs are working in relation to changing the processes in the body, the natural processes that are there for a really good reason, compared to the micronutrients. You see, micronutrients only serve to be the coenzyme factors in the natural production of things like serotonin and dopamine and all sorts of other neurotransmitters and hormones. And so there's a big difference in relation to how they're working. So it's not one or the other. One replaces the other. One may come with side effects, but it's kind of a synthetic form. No, they're working at a different level altogether. And so when you don't have enough vitamins and minerals, what will happen is that the amino acids that would typically be used to produce hormones and neurotransmitters in the body are incapable of being converted into the various neurotransmitters or hormones that you need. And your body will tell, there's processes in place that your body says, hey, we need more dopamine. Hey, we need more serotonin. Hey, we need to reward, like with the dopamine, you achieve something and now your body's saying, okay, release some dopamine, right? It's a natural process that keeps us very progressive in nature. That's, the reward circuitry is working. You just accomplished something. You overcame something. Maybe you climbed to the top of the mountain, you hit the peak and whatever. And there's a natural thing that occurs that says, let's make them feel rewarded so that they will engage in more of that type of behavior, right? It could even be as simple as connecting with a loved one. Same thing. Right? The connection's being made. Hey, let's release some oxytocin so that they feel good, so that they know that this is a good thing to be connected with other people, right? These are messenger molecules they're ultimately altering the way that we feel and the way that we operate. And it keeps us moving in the right direction, in a sense, if you will. And so micronutrients are necessary to facilitate the production of these various hormones and neurotransmitters that ultimately alter how we feel. And so if you remove that, if you are now deficient in a micronutrient, could be any particular one. So, we went over last podcast, we discussed, the neurotransmitter pathway for serotonin, and that, to get the tryptophan hydroxylase enzyme to convert tryptophan into 5-hydroxytryptophan, that there was 5 particular micronutrients, being iron, methylfolate, vitamin C, D, and B3. If you're lacking any one of those particular nutrients, that enzyme reaction doesn't happen, the conversion doesn't happen, tryptophan doesn't become 5-hydroxytryptophan, which then through another enzyme reaction will become serotonin. And so we see that just a deficiency of any one particular nutrient can completely halt the process of the production of these various neurotransmitters and hormones that we need in order to feel appropriate given our circumstances.
So let's talk a little bit more about then how micronutrients actually help resolve these symptoms, because I think one of the things, as you were talking, I was thinking about the history of psychiatry, where, back in the early 1900s, psychiatry wanted to be recognized as a valid medical field. And all these other medical fields were having these great breakthroughs, like insulin was being discovered. They had these things that were like eradicating disease. And I think that there was some hubris on the part of medicine thinking someday we're going to have a pill to solve everything, right? But psychiatry was still kind of on the outside and still not being recognized as a valid medical field. And they wanted to be part of the club. And the way that they accomplished that was by creating medical conditions out of these symptoms. And without any foundation for understanding really what was happening in the brain, and then just kind of stumbled on medications that affected the brain without fully understanding what they were doing to people's brains by using these medications. And this idea that I think the problem that has been created within psychiatry and with these symptoms is that we now I guess back in the 90s was when they first started having psychotropic drugs. So it's been like 75 years now that we have been trained in our society to believe that these are medical conditions that require medication to treat. And so when we experience, and I've seen this regularly, people will say, yes, that might be good enough for mild depression, but I have psychosis, or I have, they'll describe the intense, extreme symptoms that they experience. And they are so convinced that it is a medical condition that has to have a medical solution, that when we talk about something as simple, it really is very simple. It's, it's complex in the way that you have developed this, but it really is very simple. You're just giving the brain what it naturally needs to function in a healthy way. It is so foreign to what we believe that I think people have a hard time believing it. Like I think people have a hard time believing that micronutrients really can resolve these really extreme symptoms. And you did talk about this a little bit before with your siblings, how extreme their symptoms were and how this resolved them. But could you talk about how that actually happens? Like, what is it about giving somebody micronutrients that can actually help resolve psychosis, for example? Let's talk about that, since that's one that regularly comes up in objections to this as a treatment.
Yeah, so some of this is still theoretical because, like I said before, nobody's really hacking anybody open while they're still alive and seeing exactly what's taking place. But what we do know is that there's a fine balance that takes place within your body. Everything stays within homeostasis when you have everything that you need, right? But as soon as you start lacking certain nutrients, that's when we end up with dysfunction and imbalances taking place anywhere within the system, right? So it could be a mineral imbalance within the bones. You could have an overload of calcium and not enough of all the other bone-building minerals, and you can actually end up with a state of osteoporosis, even though you're getting more than adequate amounts of calcium, right? And so the same thing goes in the brain. In a state of psychosis, generally that's a dopamine overload. For some reason, somebody's getting too much dopamine. They're either producing too much dopamine because there's a dysfunction in relation to what's being messaged in the body or communicated in the body, that they're ending up with a dopamine overload, or perhaps they're using particular substances that would enhance the production of dopamine. And we've seen that with marijuana, actually, and it's becoming a lot more known now since it's been legalized here in Canada. But before, it seemed quite peculiar when we were, basically raising the flag saying, look, you can't be smoking marijuana while you're taking the Empower Plus, because the Empower Plus is naturally supporting your production of dopamine and regulating it. So now with all of these different nutrients, you have everything going on. All the messaging is taking place appropriately in the body. So now you're producing proper dopamine levels. Now you go and smoke marijuana and it's blowing you through the roof and you're ending up into a state of psychosis. And we've seen that many, many times, quite a bit more than what you would see out in the general public, because most people are nutrient deficient. So when they go and smoke marijuana, it's bringing them up to a more normal level of dopamine versus they were already at a normal level of dopamine. Now they smoked up and boom, now they're through the roof, and we see marijuana-induced psychosis. But we're starting to see more of that. We're starting to see the news reports come out on it about marijuana-induced psychosis and even leading to suicide. And so it's all about just giving the body what it needed all along and allowing the body to do what it needs to do. And it is incredibly complex, to the point that, like I said, a lot of it's still theoretical. We don't fully understand what's taking place. We did, in 1996, at the same time that we made the discovery here that my father's prayers had been answered and that my family received the restoration that he was so desperately pleading for, At about that same time, you had, like I mentioned last podcast, the Kyoto Encyclopedia of Genes and Genomes project start up. And that was when they began to do mapping of the neurotransmitter pathways, discovering how they were being produced and the enzymes that were involved, and then, naming the enzymes and all that, so that we kind of had a roadmap to see, if you want to produce serotonin, what do you need? What's the precursor? Tryptophan. What are the 6 nutrients necessary to incite to the enzyme reactions, the 2 enzyme reactions necessary to get to the point of taking tryptophan to serotonin, right? And we see those 6 nutrients, right? And so we have all of that being laid out, which is nice, but we still don't have it all figured out. We don't have it all figured out. I mean, it'd be a beautiful thing if we had the whole thing mapped out, and then we could just look at it and say, simple, we have this issue. Don't give them an SSRI medication, or don't give them a dopamine block. Don't give them, right? Here's how you create. Here's the ingredients necessary. The natural ingredients that they were lacking all along that prevented them from doing this on their own accord. Here's what we can do for it, right? And we're getting closer to that. In fact, oftentimes in orthomolecular medicine, they're doing a lot of different blood tests and all that to determine exactly what nutrients somebody's deficient in, and then they're supplying those. We found it much more economical and simple to just take a very broad spectrum approach that we can forego all the blood testing. We can give them a very balanced and bioavailable form of nutrition, all 36 ingredients there, and then let the body figure it out. And it does a fantastic job. And in almost every instance, we've seen that it's actually been more effective than trying to pinpoint specific nutrients that somebody's deficient in. We just give them the whole gamut of the nutrients and make sure that they're in the balance that they need to be, so that we don't offset anything in the body.
Yeah. So the thing that's interesting, though, is that I think that because the brain is so complex and because we don't really understand it, and even the scientists who say that they know that there's a chemical imbalance and everything, they don't understand it either. In fact, drug companies don't fully appreciate or understand how their drugs work. Like it is so much more complex. And one of the things that I loved that Dr. Ruckledge did was she did a TED Talk. I can't remember how many years ago, but I want to say back in like 2010 maybe, where she talked about how our treatment model has been flipped on its head, where we are going straight to mind-altering psychotropic medications that chemically alter the brain in ways that we don't fully understand. It's like playing Russian roulette with your brain, right? You give somebody a drug and you have no idea if it's going to help, if it's going to suppress the symptoms that are undesirable, or if it's going to put them into a state of psychosis or cause, suicidality. It is a very risky thing to do. But currently, that is the first thing that the doctors will go to. The very first thing that they will do is prescribe psychotropic drugs, where Professor Ruckledge, who has studied this, like this is her area of expertise, is micronutrient treatment for all of these symptoms, says that the very last thing we should do is medication. That should be the absolute last resort. The very first thing we should do is give the body what it naturally needs and see if we can address the issues using just micronutrients, because that is something that naturally our bodies need. The fact that it's in a pill, I think a lot of times that lends itself psychologically to this idea that it is, one to one, like that, you've got medications that are in a pill form, you've got micronutrients that are in a pill form. But I want to talk a little bit about why you touched on this before, but I want to talk a little bit more about why taking it in a pill form, why we need to take additional supplements in addition to what we're getting in our food, because ideally we would just eat healthy, right? And everything would be great. But the reality is that unless you're growing your own food and you're doing it by, really complex, making sure that the soil has got everything it needs and basically giving the soil micronutrients to make sure that it is fully, getting everything into the plants that it needs, we don't get what we need from our diets any longer. Our soils have been stripped, the seeds have been changed, like everything has been so altered that our bodies are not getting what they need to function in a healthy way any longer just by our diet. So can we talk a little bit about why a micronutrient treatment is ideal really for everybody, but especially for people who are displaying symptoms of mania, depression, anxiety? Can you talk a little bit about that? Sorry.
Absolutely.
It was like a complex question, but
no, that's fantastic. You laid out a lot of the basis, so really to go back in history a bit so as to understand how serious this issue is. and how acknowledged it's been, and also how covered up it's been, because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, the illness of humans. And if we were to discover what the root of the issue was, it would bankrupt that multi-billion-dollar industry overnight, right? The vast majority of the issues that we are suffering with as a human populace when it comes to chronic illness comes down to nutrient deficiency. The vast majority. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, but what about all the environmental toxins? There's a lot more poisons out there. Yes, that's true. But do you know that when you're nutrient deficient, your ability to be able to detox is significantly compromised? That the environmental toxins would not have nearly the same impact on us if we had the proper nutrients flowing through our system at any given time. And so when we take a look at the history of this, back in 1936, we're talking almost 100 years ago now, this became an issue, a very discussed issue, where in the Senate in the US, it became a Senate hearing of its own accord. And you can actually find that in Senate document 264 from 1936, where they examined Dr. I believe it's Northern's work, where he pinpointed that we were now suffering as a human populace in the Western world from significant mineral deficiencies. And one of the most powerful quotes of that entire Senate hearing is that a deficiency in any one of the important minerals will result in disease. A deficiency in just any one of them. And so we could take a look at that and say, look, if you're deficient in iodine, let's just say iodine, for example, well, it's very well known that you're going to have an issue surrounding your thyroid, right? That you need iodine in order to produce T4 hormones that then downregulate to T3 hormones. The T3 hormones are responsible for regulating the metabolic rate of every single cell in your body. So we're talking about, your metabolism here, your energy levels, your levels of vitality, just based off one mineral. And just to go back to the T4 and T3 hormones, the 4 in the T4 is how many atoms of iodine are present in that molecule. So it's not just that it could be useful in the production of T4 and T3 hormones. It's absolutely crucial. You can't have T4 and T3 hormones without iodine absolutely present in there. So if you're deficient in that, you can't produce those hormones. Can't produce those hormones, your vitality for life is going to be way out of whack because the metabolic rate of every single cell in the body is not happening appropriately. So that's just one mineral. If we were to take a look at calcium, for example, obviously we're gonna say that you're gonna have a negative impact if you're deficient in calcium on your skeletal system, right? You can end up with osteoporosis. Well, calcium plays way more roles than just that, but that is the main one that is very tangible. But we see that across the board. You'd mentioned, the drug companies developing insulin back years ago, these life-saving medications. Their discovery of insulin is an interesting one as well, because we're going to talk about 6 other crucial nutrients here that if you're lacking them, your pancreas is not going to be able to produce adequate levels of insulin. And that's chromium, vanadium, potassium, selenium, magnesium, and zinc, right? You have 6 key minerals there necessary for the production of insulin. And so when we're taking a look at this, when we take a look in 1936, they already identified that there was a deficiency occurring that was resulting in a rise in disease, hence why they had the Senate hearing. And that you have quotes like that coming out that's saying, a deficiency in any one of the important minerals will result in disease, right? Why? Because you now have systems in your body that are no longer functioning. And when you end up with dysfunction, it will inevitably manifest as a tangible, diagnosable disease. And so now when we fast forward, you say, well, 1936, okay, well, they corrected the issue. They didn't. See, the issue back then was as a result of farming methods where they had depleted the mineral content in the soils. So all that they had to do at that point in time to remedy this issue was to restore the mineral content found in the soils. But then we have something else that gets introduced that compounds the issue. And this is highlighted in the British Food Journal from a publication from Anne-Marie Meyer. She's a researcher out of the UK who actually did a lot of the soil sample analysis, highlighting that we have less than 50% of the mineral content found in the soils, right? Well, her and her team, what they did is they analyzed in 1997 20 common fruits and vegetables that we'd be eating a number of them anyways on a daily basis, typically in the Western world. So they analyzed the 20 common fruits and vegetables that typically would be found in our diet. And what they did is they compared the analysis of the numbers surrounding the mineral content found within those fruits and vegetables. They compared it to the numbers that they had from 1947. So we have a 50-year span taking place here. And so remember, 1936, it's bad enough that disease is on the rise. 1947, they still haven't done anything about it. But now from 1947 to 1997, what they discovered is that in many of the key nutrients, there was an over 80% reduction within the minerals found in those 20 common fruits and vegetables. So it was already bad in 1947, but based on those numbers, we went from bad to extremely bad. And basically the numbers are highlighting that you'd have to eat about 6.5 times the amount of a spinach salad today as what your great-grandparents would have had to eat to get the same nutrient values out of it. So make the healthy choices. You're still unfortunately lacking in the mineral content. And so you'd mentioned about gardening. I mean, that's something that's really near and dear to my heart. I mean, you know, if I was to look at my windows right now, I'm looking at pear trees and I'm looking at elderberry bushes right here. I'm looking at apple trees that direction. I'm looking at sea buckthorn. I mean, I'm looking at all sorts of fruits and then vegetables. I've got, you know, garden boxes and greenhouses, and we're doing that as really kind of a pet project, if you will, right? It's just really a hobby, although we love doing it and we want to be self-sufficient, but we love doing it for this sake that can we get our food to be our medicine? Hippocrates said it 2,400 years ago, let food be thy medicine, medicine be thy food. And so are we able to actually get the food to become our medicine again, where we're getting everything that we need to thrive out of our food? Because right now we're not. If you go to the grocery store, and even if you're buying organic, which we buy, the vast majority of the food that we consume is organic, yet I still can't go without supplementing with the Empire Plus, neither can my wife or my children, in relation to maintaining our level of mental well-being as well as physical well-being, because this isn't just mental health, this is health. These are crucial nutrients for every aspect of our body, every system in the body thriving off of them. So we've introduced, I went and bought a couple of years ago, 4,000 pounds of composted mineral, and I spread it all over my trees and in my garden boxes. Okay, so this is rock, this ground up rock, in essence, mineral content that's then been put through a composting process so as to add organic elements to it. And so it's already basically somewhat pre-converted that by the time it goes into the soil, it's actually usable by the plants. And it's coming from multiple sources around the world so as to ensure that there's a very wide balance, wide array of this mineral covering off of all the essential trace minerals that you would need for plants to thrive and ultimately our bodies to thrive. So then I spread that all over, and then I go and I take a bunch of compost tea and I spray it as an activator. Why? You want to introduce the bacteria content. You want to incite microbial activity within the soil, because the soil is supposed to be actually really similar to our gut. And our gut thrives when it has the proper microflora, when you have a well-balanced array of bacteria taking place in there. And when that gets offset, then digestion doesn't happen appropriately, uptake of nutrients doesn't happen appropriately, and you're going to find that you're going to have a health condition. Well, the same thing is in nature within the soil. You have microbial activity that when it's in the proper balance and it's thriving, that the uptake of nutrients takes place to the plants thrive within that medium and everything does well. And then when you eat those plants, you do well. And so I did that. And then I've then put probably about 40,000 pounds of wood chips as a covering so as to preserve that bacteria, to preserve that microbial activity taking place by retaining moisture and being an insulator so that on hot days, it's not that hot in the soil, and on cold days, it's not that cold. So it moderates everything, including moisture levels. And so we've been doing that, and so that our plants do way better, and they do, and that they're producing food that is nutrient rich. So eventually, at some point in time, maybe I can say that we don't require vitamin and mineral supplementation because we're getting it out of our food. But even with all of these measures that we've been taking place, and we're still kind of in its infancy, we're only about 10 years into this, and things don't grow that well here. We're high elevation, wind-torn country, stuff just doesn't thrive, and the land that we were working with was pretty destitute. It didn't have a whole lot of nitrogen levels, hence, which would go back to lack of bacterial activity, microbial activity in the soil. And so we've really been working with, in an undesirable environment, and we're turning it into a desirable environment. But it's taken basically 10 years to get to the point that stuff's starting to thrive. So it may come to the point that supplementation is necessary. But at this point in time, with all of the measures that we're taking, eating organic, eating incredibly clean, avoiding as much toxic exposure as possible, growing a lot of our own food. My wife, myself, my children all need the supplementation. And when they don't get it, we see it. Like if our kids don't get enough of the Empower Plus, we see it in their behavior very, very quickly. That's the indicator as to whether or not they're getting enough of the micronutrient supplementation. And so unfortunately, we're still at a place where our food isn't providing everything that we want it to. And I don't want to provide a message of lacking hope there, because there is hope. We do have to go back to nature. We do have to go back to growing our own food, or at least teaming up with growers that are growing really nutrient-dense food, that they're making sure that it's quality, that they have everything in the soil that's necessary to facilitate healthy plants, producing healthy fruits and vegetables for us to consume, or raising cattle or any livestock on feed that is nutrient-dense, that the animals themselves will be healthy. The fact of the matter is that we have to go back to that regardless if we want good health outcomes. But in the interim, we are in a place that we require nutrient supplementation to supplement the vitamins and minerals that we aren't adequately getting out of our food.
Yeah. And one of the other pieces that I hear regularly when people are objecting to, this idea of vitamins fixing, bipolar, is the hereditary piece. And so people will say, it's absolutely a chemical imbalance. It's absolutely a medical condition. It's been in our family for 3 generations. My father had it, my grandfather had it, all of my siblings. You don't know what it's like, and a bunch of, vitamins aren't going to fix this. And it was interesting to me because this was one thing that I struggled to overcome. When I was first learning about this, I knew it was helping me, but I didn't have the confidence to go say to other people, like, this is where we need to go first. Like, if you want to heal, the first step is getting this medication out of your system, getting your brain what it needs to function in a healthy way, so that we can start looking to see if there are other sources of symptoms in your life. When I read The Better Brain by Drs. Bonnie Kaplan and Dr. Julia Ruckledge, I was so fascinated to read the section that talked about, specifically about your family, interestingly enough, that they are starting to understand that there are genetic predispositions to require higher levels of micronutrition. Like there is a genetic component. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I feel like, especially with your family history, I know that in my family, there is a genetic component. Like I'm the oldest of 10 kids. 2 of us were diagnosed with bipolar. 6 were diagnosed with ADHD. If you go back one generation, it wasn't diagnosed, but there are symptoms that later on were recognized. Like you would have been diagnosed with ADHD if you go back another generation. So there's obviously a genetic component here. So can you talk a little bit about that and how micronutrients actually do help with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we were to dive into epigenetics, which is more of a newer study, really quite an enlightening study, though, because it helps to break down false paradigms that, the whole concept is when a doctor says, oh, it's genetic, immediately as a populace, we interpret that as, oh, it's incurable. There's nothing we can do about our genes. Well, the fact of the matter is, and I come from a family of there's 13 of us. It's a little bit of a mixed family, but there's 9 of us, as full siblings. And then I have 2 half siblings, and an adopted sibling, and then a stepsister as well, right? So it's a bit mixed, but the fact of the matter is it's a large enough sample to see how genetics play out differently from one person to the next based on what they consume, based on what the environment is that they create within their body. Right. And, vast differences, even in relation to weight, let's say, right, that there's a big difference that occurs from one person to the next if they have all the supplementation, if they really take care of their health that way, just in relation to what, based on family history, what they'd anticipate it to look like weight-wise. And so epigenetics is the concept that we have the ability to change our genetic expressions, what genes are manifest based on the environment that we create internally. And we've seen that definitely to be the case in multiple aspects. Now, there's also another, I think I probably touched on it last week in relation to genetic mutations that we've seen where even genetic mutations are corrected. And we've seen that first and foremost with the MTHFR gene mutation. We don't have it. This isn't an exact science at this point in time. Unfortunately, we haven't had any researchers pick up on this to study it because we don't do our own studies in essence. We do have a database where we have been able to track a lot of people's symptoms, but we haven't put this in as something to monitor yet. And unfortunately, because I think we'd have enough data at this point in time that we could have at least been able to make a difference in helping science progress in relation to the MTHFR gene mutation. But we have seen numerous examples where somebody ends up with the MTHFR gene mutation, or maybe they had it all along and they got tested positive for it. And then they've gotten on the Empower Plus, and 3-4 months down the road, they get retested for it and they don't have the MTHFR gene mutation anymore. They're now able to methylate appropriately, which is absolutely crucial for health. Methylation is a very crucial element of life itself. And if you're not methylating, then in essence, you're dying, right? And it may not be an overnight death, but the fact of the matter is that you are in the process of dying, where there's going to be significant dysfunction within your system. You're going to be trying to remedy it with Band-Aid solutions. So we've also seen it in relation to, this is where we first saw the correction of genetic mutations. There's 2 genetic mutations that occur in order to create the condition called hemochromatosis, where somebody is incapable of, handling iron appropriately, right? It doesn't assimilate into their system properly, and it builds up in their bloodstream to toxic levels. And if they're not careful with the food that they consume, and if they're eating iron-rich foods, they'll actually need a bloodletting to relieve some of that blood, the iron-rich blood, and then they'll produce new blood so as to basically dilute the amount of iron that's within their bloodstream so as to prevent it from reaching toxic levels. Well, we've seen that the use of Empower Plus very slowly, but very slowly at the introduction of it, where you only take 1 capsule per day, right? And as we talked last week, many people are taking 6-9 capsules per day now, even today. But you take 1 capsule per day for 1 week because it has iron in it. Otherwise, you'll elevate the levels of iron too quickly, and you have to correct the underlying issue before you can get them on a full dose. At week 2, they take 2 capsules per day. At week 3, they take 3 capsules per day, et cetera, et cetera. And by week 6, for the vast majority of people, it's corrected. They can take 6 capsules of Empower Plus a day, no issues. There are some people that have been a little more sensitive, where we basically slow it down by 50%. So, they'll take 1 capsule for 2 weeks, and then for the next 2 weeks, they'll take 2 capsules. So it takes them 12 weeks to get up to the 6 capsules per day. But the fact of the matter is that we get to the point that they're now taking a supplement that contains iron, and then their iron levels normalize. And it's really cool to see. It's like one of the individuals I personally worked with was, at the time that I was working with him, he was probably 49, 50. He's now, 55, 60. And still his iron levels are in the normal range. And yet all of the other years, his adult life, whenever he'd have blood work done, he was high on the iron. He had to be very watchful of his food. In fact, his sister even learned how to do the bloodletting, in essence, so that he didn't have to go to the hospital all the time. But as soon as they started to see the symptoms of an overabundance of iron, she would engage in doing the bloodletting so as to remedy the elevated iron levels. That hasn't taken place now in 7 years. So it's amazing. So going back to the whole genetic aspect, yes, there's absolutely a genetic component to this. You take a look at my family, go back generations, enough generations that if you were to take a look at my second, third cousins, you can see that there's still, it's what we saw in our home is oftentimes present in even long distant cousins. So, this came through my Italian side of the family, my mother's side of the family going up, and it hasn't been good. And it doesn't seem to go away from one generation to the next. And yet here we've broken that cycle as a family now, where now we're 2 getting into 3 generations from down that haven't had to suffer what all the previous generations had to suffer simply by putting the proper nutrition into our bodies.
Yeah. And it's one of the things that you talked about is, so a lot of times we think that these conditions, when you hear about genetic, something's genetic, it's our brain hears incurable, right? Because that's the way that we've been conditioned in a very medically focused society where, we need doctors, we need experts, which is, I think, one of the challenges that we've had with this highly specialized society as well, is that we tend to separate the brain and the body and all the different parts into sections and stop thinking about the entire system as a whole. And what you're talking about is, our brains and our bodies have an incredible capacity to heal if it has all the things that it needs, right? And so when your body it makes sense. Like if somebody completely removed protein from their diet, we would understand that they would get sick because your body needs protein to heal muscles. There's all these different functions that protein serves in the body. We learned, unfortunately, the hard way when there was this like non-fat, no fat, craze back in the 80s and 90s, that our bodies actually need healthy fat. Like we don't want unhealthy fats in our diet. Like that's not good for us, but your brain needs healthy fat to function in a healthy way. Like it's a building block that we need. And people were getting sick and people were getting, it was increasing diseases. And so, what you're talking about is simply giving the body and the brain the building blocks back that it needs, the pieces back that it needs to function in a healthy way and to heal itself. And it's incredible to be, even like one of the things that I'm so grateful for is that before I titrated off of medications, that I found Truehope, because learning now about what people go through with all of the issues that they have, that these medications cause in their brains, the damage that it does, I haven't dealt with most of those things. And I don't think I was on a lot of medication for, over a decade. And I'm confident, like the more that I learn about these things, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's such a blessing that my brain got what it needed to start healing itself. And over the years, my brain has gotten healthier and healthier, and symptoms have resolved and issues have resolved. And I didn't understand or fully appreciate at the time that it was because I was giving my brain, I wasn't just removing the medication, I was actually giving my brain what it needed so that it was able to heal itself and able to recover and function in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's amazing. It really is. There's a beautiful and very powerful example in nature that really galvanizes this whole particular topic about, genetics and nutrition. Do you know what the difference is between a queen bee and every other bee, the worker bees?
No, I don't. One's bigger than the others. I know that.
Well, So is there an actual physical difference between them, right?
Well, there has to be, because she's the one who's able to reproduce, right?
There is. There's a massively different, physically when you're a queen bee versus the other bees. Like it is so clear. And their functions are so incredibly different that the other bees can't possibly do what the queen bee does. But do you know what the actual difference is that caused a queen bee to become that? What they consumed. Royal jelly. That's it. If you were to give any one of those bees the royal jelly, they would take on the same genetic components as that queen bee. But they were selected for it. They were given the royal jelly. They became the queen bee. That's it. That's a beautiful example in the sense that it shows that how drastic of a difference the genetic expression can be just based on what is put into our systems.
Yeah.
That we are not confined to our genetic makeup. Our genetic makeup is huge. None of us are expressing all of our genes. Plain and simple, right? We get to choose that. If we understand it, we have the ability to choose it, because then we can tailor what we're consuming to facilitate certain genetic expressions while suppressing other genetic expressions.
Well, and one of the things that's interesting too is that we have created discrete medical conditions out of these symptom clusters that truly are very arbitrary. Like even when I was studying Bessel van der Kolk's, his writings on and studies and that on research on trauma, he talks about how like subjective the criteria is for these diagnoses. Because not only have we created diagnoses and then expanded the definitions to make sure we fit everybody into a diagnosis, but they are self-reported, subjective criterion that vary from person to person. And then we say, for example, in my family, myself and my children, I have bipolar disorder. I wouldn't qualify for any mental health conditions or diagnoses now because I don't have any of the symptoms anymore. But at the time, I was initially diagnosed with depression and anxiety, and then that changed to bipolar 2. And then I was told I had PTSD, and then I was told then it was changed to bipolar 1. So I kept having these things, and it was like this moving target. Like, okay, what do I have? What is it exactly that I have? And they're still telling me that it's a chemical imbalance. And I'm thinking, why can't you measure my chemicals then? And my son was diagnosed with ADHD. And thankfully, by the time my son was diagnosed with this, I was off medications. I was healing, was learning more about micronutrients and that. And there was absolutely no way I was going to put him on ADHD medications. And so I started giving him the micronutrients. And because he was diagnosed with this, he was put into like special categories at school and stuff like that. But as he grew older, each year they review, his education plan and all these things, but they weren't seeing the same issues with him that they were seeing with other kids. This discrete medical condition that everybody else had and everybody was having the same problems, my son was not having those same issues. And I finally, by the time he was a sophomore in high school, the special education teacher who was over all of this came to me and asked me what I was doing, because she said, your son is not having all the same issues that these other kids are having. And I'm having parents come to me for help. What are you doing with your son? And I said, well, I don't give him ADHD medication. She got super curious then. She said, well, what do you do to help him? Because he's able to focus. She was listing off all of these things that he was able to do, these, like he was a special kid. And I'm like, I just give him micronutrients. And I talked to her about that. And she started sending parents to me because the parents were seeing all these distressing things in their kids. And I said, their brains just don't get what they need to function in a healthy way. And then you muck up the brain further with these chemicals that are changing the brain function in a developing brain. And so, of course, by the time they're in high school, there's some pretty significant issues because their brains have been chemically altered during their these years that they're growing up. So, that's one of the things that I would like actually for you to talk a little bit more about, because sometimes when people hear that there's been studies for, some of the things that I can think of, and you can add to this list, bipolar, obviously, because we're talking about that, and that was where this started for you guys. But depression, anxiety, ADHD, OCD, it is incredible, all of the different applications. And it kind of, you have to challenge your understanding of what these diagnoses actually mean in order to understand how this is working. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how is it that the same thing that's being used to treat my bipolar is able to treat my son's ADHD symptoms and successfully, like, resolving the symptoms?
Yeah, great question. Because this has become one of the biggest topics of controversy surrounding this, where it looks like snake oil because it does everything, right? Traditionally, mental health supplement would be some tailored herbs. Maybe they would even add some neurotransmitters, 5-HTP is applied a lot, GABA. And so when you're talking about utilizing those types of things, they're very pinpointed as to the application. So if you're using one particular supplement that was taking that model, a herb/neurotransmitter model, and you're using for ADHD, it would look a lot different than something that would be used for depression, right? And you wouldn't use the one for depression for ADHD and expect good outcomes. So it really comes back to the whole basis of what we're doing, and then identifying what these issues actually are in reality. And so being that we're only supplying the fundamental nutrients that you needed all along, 33 out of the 36 ingredients you get on a daily basis out of your food, just not in adequate levels, but you get 33 out of the 36 ingredients every single day out of your food. They are fundamental, essential nutrients that your body cannot go without. The other three ingredients, if you eat citrus, you're getting one of those ingredients right there, the citrus bioflavonoids. If you eat grapes with seeds in them and you chew the seeds, which I highly recommend you do, by the way, you're getting the seed extract, right? So there's 35 ingredients, 36 ingredient you're likely never going to get out of your diet, being that it's ginkgo biloba, not unless you go and you're chewing on that. And I don't know anybody who does that. But the ginkgo biloba there is really a delivery agent to make sure that the nutrition is getting to the brain as well. And so you have one herb, and then you've got all these other nutrients that are found in your daily food, unless you're not eating grapes with the seeds or citrus. And so the approach that we're taking is a lot different, where we're just going right to the root of what does the body need and allowing the body to do the fixing, right? Rather than us trying to stimulate or to interject, right? Which is what we do when we apply things like 5-HTP. It's kind of approaching it from a drug model, really, because you can overdo it, right? How much do you need? Well, we don't know. let's just give them this much. This is what we generally find works well. Well, may work well for one, doesn't work very well for another, may not work for another, may overdo it for another. And so we're allowing the body to produce what it needs by giving the fundamental nutrients. So at the end of the day, when people were coming to my father and saying, hey, you see the difference in your son, Joseph, like he's a completely different person. What have you done with him? And then the questions started rising. Will it work for my wife with depression, my son with ADHD, et cetera, the agoraphobia and schizophrenia from the lady down the street and all that type of stuff. And my father said, I don't know, it worked for this, try it, right? Completely clueless as to, oh yeah, of course, these are all nutrient deficiency disorders. It wouldn't be till time, as time went on, that we discovered, wait a minute, this same formula without any custom tailoring, without changing a single ingredient in it, is working equally as well for ADHD as it did for the bipolar that it was originally studied for. It's working for the psychosis, right? And so now they study that and they validate that. And, basically you can take the whole DSM-4 at the time that we were doing this, it's now DSM-5, and just write on the front, nutrient deficiency disorders. Really, like that's it for the vast majority of it. I mean, obviously there's going to be the odd one that you could debate on, that you could say, well, the nutrients don't quite work as well, but it's covered off a particular element of it, and we needed to, engage in some other type of modalities but that is the odd one out. The vast majority of these conditions that are being put into a box as a diagnosis, as mental health conditions, the vast majority of them are simply just nutrient deficiency disorders. That's it.
Well, and one of the things that when I started going through the healing process, I didn't know, first of all, that I was healing. I, at the time, for many years actually, after, thought I had that mindset, I'm trading one pill for another pill, right? But I was doing better on it. And so I was happy that I found something that actually worked for my brain. And I encouraged other people to look at it. If they were not finding, balance, whenever people would say, well, I can't, medication saved my life, I always ask them, so what does your life look like right now? If medication saved your life, are you completely stable all the time? Does your brain work in a really, in a normal way, healthy way? I should say, I don't like the word normal, but in a healthy way. And so, invariably, no, there's a reason why it's so popular to talk about bipolar symptoms and normalizing things and stuff like that online, because people think that they have to live with these symptoms. Like the idea is you're going to learn how to suffer well with this for the rest of your life, right? But one of the things that I discovered is there were a couple of reasons why I developed these symptoms in the first place. I started with my childhood. I ate pretty healthy growing up. My mom was like, I'm the oldest of 10 kids. Back then it was like, go to the farmer's market and buy a box of apples for, $6 or something. Like it was the cheapest way was to eat whole foods. It is not that way anymore, unfortunately. So I was eating a very healthy diet and I was very active. I was a competitive swimmer, but there was this genetic predisposition and to need more than what I was getting through my diet. And I went through trauma. There was trauma in my childhood. There was trauma in my young adult years that again, we talked a little bit about, how when you're under a tremendous amount of stress, your brain is burning through the nutrients faster. And so if it doesn't have what it needs to support it, it will not be able to cope. You mentioned the Christchurch, I think it was Christchurch. Was it Christchurch? New Zealand? Yeah. That the study that they did with the earthquake down there, that all the people were going through the same stressors, but the people who had micronutrients had significantly lower levels of depression and anxiety because their brains were able to cope with the stress more because their brains were getting what they needed to function in a healthy way and to handle what was going on. So when somebody goes through trauma, they are burning through the nutrients faster. So if they're not getting what they need, and especially, I think that's all, my theory is that the reason why so many people get diagnosed in their young adult years is we move away from home, start feeding ourselves ramen, ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, and our brains just don't get what they need. And then you've got all this additional stressors of supporting yourself in your life, and you just aren't equipped to handle all of the stressors, and your brain isn't functioning in a healthy way. And so all of a sudden these symptoms come on. And instead of somebody asking any kind of inquisitive questions about what was going on with me, they just diagnosed me into this box and gave me drugs. So the underlying issues were never addressed. The underlying issues were never identified and addressed. And then we further dysregulated my brain with psychotropic drugs. So when I started going through the healing process, my brain started healing. And it's interesting because there's like these levels of healing. So I remember this one day, I share this in my book, that I woke up one day. I think I'd been on Truehope for about 3 or 4 months. And I had one day when I woke up and it felt like the first time I was fully awake in over a decade. I was like my brain felt like awake. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Anybody if you've never been on medication, it will be really hard to understand what I'm talking about. But medications sedate you, like they, or they can elevate you too. But like your brain does not feel right. There's a reason why people are non-compliant with their medication. Your brain just does not feel right on them. And I had this day that I woke up and it felt like it was the first time I was like fully awake in over a decade. And I called my husband excited, and he was actually worried that I was manic. He was like, "Oh, are you okay?" And I'm like, no. I just feel normal. Like, my brain feels normal. Is this what normal people feel like? I kept saying, like, is this what a normal person feels like? And so I had like this, I would have these like experiences where I would get to a new level of healing and my brain would get to a new level of health. And I would like, oh my gosh, like this is what a normal person feels like. But there was still a ways to go. And so that's one of the reasons why, like, this isn't going to necessarily resolve all the things, because maybe for me, I had trauma processing that needed to be done. But getting the medication out of the way and giving my brain what it needed to function in a healthy way actually made it possible for me to process and resolve the trauma from my childhood. And which is why, like, when people come into my program, we always start with this. Like, you have to get off the medications if you want to heal. If they don't want to get off medications, I am not the right person to help them, because if you want to resolve all these other issues, you've got to get the medication out of the way and give your brain what it needs to function in a healthy way in order to be able to process trauma, heal trauma, like resolve all these other issues in your life. So I'm sorry, I guess there's not entirely a question there, but that's one of the things that is so, not to be like hyperbolic, but miraculous about this treatment. Because it is not just it is not just a vitamin mineral supplement. You have designed something that gives the brain what it needs in a balanced way, so that the body can then take what it needs from the supplement. The body is really smart about identifying what it needs. And so you give it everything, and then it just says, I need this, and I need this, and I need this, and then we're going to make it all work. And then your brain begins to heal, and it begins to act in the miraculous way that it was designed to behave in the first place. And then we can deal with all of the stressors and trauma and issues that come up in our lives in a way that we can actually address them and heal them, rather than just cope with them for the rest of our lives.
Exactly. We've seen that time and time again where people come to us and they've been doing different therapies, counseling and all that, which, these things can be good, but it hasn't stuck. And the reason why is because they're not in the right mind to be able to actually interpret the information that's coming at them, to be able to actually employ the tools that they're being given through those different modalities. But once the brain gets right, and now you start to see different, like you were communicating there, all of a sudden you wake up and it's like, whoa, this is a different reality. Like, what is this? And it's a more pleasant reality. In some instances, though, if somebody comes out of sedation, they realize that there's a lot more to it than they realize. And that can be a little bit scary in and of itself, that, oh boy, they're now cognizant of all the stuff that they've done in the past and the effect that it's had on people around them. And that can be a little bit painful, but you're now empowered with the tools that you need to be able to correct those things, to be able to internalize, to be able to see what is before you more objectively, with more clarity, and then be able to deal with it appropriately. So for some people, it's a bit of an uphill battle when they wake up, for lack of better terms, they wake up, their brain is all of a sudden functioning the way that it's supposed to, and they realize that there's a little bit of mopping up that needs to be done, that there's a cleanup, maybe a few aisles, not just aisle 5, right? That you need to, but the fact of the matter is that they're capable of doing it. They're capable of identifying the issues and then rectifying them. And that's a beautiful thing, because ultimately, nobody wants to live, kind of dumbed down. Some people will resort to that. That's where alcoholism comes from, largely, is, drown out our problems, right? That's where the whole premise of self-medication comes into play. But when we give our body what it needs, we're able to be emboldened and empowered to go and move forward appropriately and actually deal with the issues head on rather than trying to drown them out.
Well, and one of the things that, like, you brought this up, there's actually two things that I want to address here. One of them is Professor Joanna Moncrief, who has made it her life's work to study drug action and actually study what's happening with these medications and make people aware of it so that they do have informed consent rather than just taking doctors at their, their doctor's claims at face value and the drug claims at face value. She's worked really hard to make sure people understand what these drugs are actually doing. And she talks about how there really isn't any difference between legalized psychotropic medications and illicit drugs. They're doing the same thing in the brain. They are serving the same function. And there's a reason why we call it, like, it's interesting that they call it self-medication, because that's what it is. When somebody is numbing out with alcohol, or they're using marijuana, or they're, going to even harder drugs, there's something that is missing. There's something, the body is asking for something. The brain is asking for something. We don't know what to do. And so we numb it out. We turn off. In fact, I saw this really great analogy the other day that when you give somebody an antidepressant, and I put that in scare quotes because that is a marketing name for the drug. That is not actually what it's doing. But he says, like, giving somebody an antidepressant when they're depressed is like turning the fire alarm off when there's a fire. Like, it doesn't resolve the fire. It just shuts off the warning, right? There's something going on. And which leads me to the second thing, which is I had somebody in my program who, as she was coming off the medication, started having increased issues with alcohol. And I had some suspicions about it, but this was one of those things where I'm constantly saying, okay, call Truehope. Like, I don't know what's going on here. I said, it's possible that as you're coming out of the medication stupor, that you're starting to feel things that were suppressed before that need to be addressed, but call Truehope just to make sure. And it was interesting because I think that there's two things going on. I think the thing that I was saying was actually happening. But the other issue was Truehope said that there were micronutrients that needed to be addressed. They talk about this in The Better Brain, that a lot of times people will struggle to get off, stop drinking alcohol because the body is asking for something that you're not giving it. And it is kind of, I don't know exactly what's happening with the alcohol, but when you give it the proper micronutritional balance, you no longer have the cravings for the alcohol. And that was fascinating to me.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I mean, I'm a personal testament to that as well, that, not to digress too much, but, I went through 10 years of an incredible battle that was really kind of a continuation of the Truehope battle that we had with Health Canada, wherein we won in the courts and all that. Well, now, I ended up having tragic passing of my son in 2012. And it turns out that when we dug in, that there was a major issue of criminal negligence resulting in his death based on the medical system and how we interfaced with them, and that they had withdrawn the equipment out of the ambulances in the South Zone here in Alberta. And so there was a cover-up that took place, but not just a cover-up, there was also an agenda to be pushed in relation to an attack on, as one judge would put it, choice of care here in Canada. And it's still being used today, still the death of my son still being exploited today by Health Canada to try to push new regulations with them using the false narrative that was created. And we expose that openly. The point is, and there's a whole film about that, by the way, but the point is that during that 10-year battle where, I stood to lose my other children, me and my wife did, and jail time was hovering over our heads at any given time. In fact, during one of the trials, I was wrongfully convicted, and then we had to go through the whole rigmarole and all that, and I ended up in jail for 3 weeks in solitary confinement based on what the media had done in helping push this agenda forward. They made me look like a really evil, bad person. But throughout all of that, it's interesting because we noticed how important it was to be physically and spiritually healthy, to make sure that we're being physically and spiritually nourished. And it's absolutely crucial. And, it's interesting because, I've had the odd organic beer here and there and the odd organic wine. And what's interesting is that throughout that whole process of going through that turmoil, never once did I actually have a craving to indulge in any of that, even though I wasn't completely foreign to it. So that was really interesting to me because I'm in the circumstances that would dictate that, it's a high risk situation in relation to giving oneself over to alcoholism. And yet nothing, never had those cravings, never felt the need to indulge, to try to drown out anything. Yeah. It's interesting because Dr. Julia Ruckledge talks about that as well in her TED Talk, where she talks about the reward circuitry, right? That's a study. The medical journal publication talks about the reward circuitry, but she cites that study or references it in her TED Talk, where she talks about how in these studies they found that people didn't just get well mentally, but that they also had an alleviation of the need for cannabis, tobacco, and alcohol.
No. Which is incredible. When you start getting down to first give your brain what it needs to function in a healthy way, and then start parsing apart the different sources of symptoms. When we look at these as an illness, it makes somebody feel like a victim. They feel helpless. They don't feel like they have any control over it. And I'm grateful because there was something internal in me that was rejecting what I was being told. When I would go to therapy sessions, especially after I had children, my children saved my life, literally. Like they were the impetus, they were the catalyst, they were the whole reason that I just kept fighting and trying. But I would go to therapy sessions or go to my psychiatrist for, med checks and talk about all the issues that we were having and how damaging it was to my, relationship with my husband and what it was doing to my kids. And their solution was, we should get them in for a session where we can help them understand what you're going through and understand, that this isn't your fault and stuff. And I remember listening to that thinking, okay, maybe it's not my fault, but it's absolutely not their fault. And they don't deserve this. Like that just did not sit right with me. But I didn't have anything else to offer. I didn't have any, I couldn't figure out what to do about it because based on what I've been told, this was a chronic condition that I was going to have for the rest of my life. And I didn't know how to resolve the problems that I was creating in my relationship with my husband and my children. And so it creates a victim mindset because you feel very helpless. You feel like you don't have any control over what's going on. One of the other things that I struggled a lot with, and this happened even after my medication, was I would have like a hair trigger with anger. And I was very frustrating going to therapists who would say like, well, count to 10 and things like just inane suggestions. And I'm like, you don't understand. There's like no space for me to make a choice. This isn't something where I'm like having something and I'm getting angry. It's like the stimulus and the response are like happening at the same time. And I have this like out of control rage where I'm dissociating and watching myself scream like a banshee at my little 2-year-old boy. And then I'm feeling like when it finally all subsides, I'm like feeling like a horrible person. And I'm like, I'm abusing my child and I don't want to do this, but I don't know how to stop myself. And I finally got off the medication. And for a couple of years, like my brain, like I said, there's different levels of healing. And I was like getting better and better. But I had one day when I had one of those outbursts with my son. And Truehope, just so anybody who's listening know, if you haven't worked with them yet, if you don't talk to them for a while, they will call you, just check in with you. And just say, hey, we're checking in. And I had one of those days where I hadn't talked to him for a while. And she happened to call on the same day that I'd had this outburst. So it was fresh on my mind. She was asking how I was doing. And I was kind of talking through it. And I just happened to mention, like, I had this outburst with my son and I'm just feeling so embarrassed right now. I'm sorry. I'm kind of feeling a little rattled. And so she started asking me questions, which I thought was odd because I'm like, this feels a little intrusive. But she's asking me like kind of probing questions about the experience that I had. And after a couple of minutes of talking to her, she's like, sweetie, you need salmon oil. And I'm like, what? She's like, you're missing a nutrient. Your brain needs salmon oil. And I thought, my brain at first was like, I'd been dealing with this for so long. I'm like, no, this is a moral issue. Like, I just don't have any self-control. And she's like, no. And so she gave me the amount that I needed to take. I started taking it. And within like 2 weeks, it was resolved. And I was all of the tools that I had been trying to work on, mindfulness, meditation, all that other stuff actually started working because my brain was getting what it needed to function in a healthy way. It was the craziest thing. It is so crazy to me. I don't want to keep using the word crazy. That's probably not advisable, but it's really fascinating to me how we have been so convinced that these are illnesses, that they're chronic, and we just believe them. And we just allow ourselves to be victims to these things rather than recognizing you can take responsibility. You can take ownership back of what's happening in your brain and your body if you just give it what it needs to function in a healthy way.
Exactly. Exactly. In fact, actually, that's like a snippet right out of our mission, vision, values statement is about giving people back, the individual ownership of health.
No. Okay. So last week we went an hour and a half. We're at an hour and 20 minutes or 12 minutes right now. So we're going to stop here. I think we've come to a good point because the next thing that we're going to talk about next week is we're going to talk about some of the issues that people have when they are trying to get off of medication and onto the micronutrients. Because we have been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that these symptoms are illness, that when somebody starts to experience symptoms that come from your brain healing and you getting over medicated or going through withdrawal or those kinds of issues, people start to freak out and think, oh, this isn't working. I need to go back on my medication. So make sure you guys tune in for the next episode. We are going to have an incredible conversation. I'm super excited about this conversation. I'm excited about all of it, but I'm really looking forward to this one because we are going to talk about what the symptoms are that you will experience as you go through the process of cross titration, or I think Truehope calls it cross tapering. As you get off of the medication and onto the micronutrients, as your brain heals, there are symptoms you'll experience. And as we were going to talk about all the different types of symptoms, what they mean, and how you can manage this in a successful way to actually help your brain heal and get off the medication and start moving towards a balanced, healthy life. So do you have any last words, David, before we close?
Well, I'm just grateful that you're doing this, and I'm sure that this is going to serve to really be empowering to a lot of people. And I'm looking forward to the next conversations, getting into the nitty gritty in relation to the cross tapering process, because that's always a fun one in relation to, staying kind of that narrow straight line in between withdrawal and over medication. Because if you don't withdraw fast enough, then you'll end up in over medication. If you withdraw too fast, you'll end up with withdrawal symptoms. So I'm looking forward to that conversation because that's a very powerful one for anybody who is looking to come off medications as safely and effectively as possible.
Awesome. Oh, I'm so excited. Thank you so much, David. This has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Michelle.
All right. Until next time, Upsiders.